Hello everybody, this is Gustavo, exam coach. Welcome to a new video in which I will develop in length the theory of clauses and sentences in written English. You know, I've first published a series of videos in which I gave you some insights, some ideas about the theory of clauses and sentences that is very necessary for anyone taking the GMAT exam, particularly if you're preparing for the so-called GMAT sentence correction questions. Now, the foundation of the theory that you need to analyze correctly a written English sentence starts here. So today we have a session which will be a little lengthy. It will be about an hour or so, in which we'll discuss in length the concept of clause and sentence in written English. All right, for those who've been following my short videos on this topic, you're most welcome because now you will have the opportunity to see more examples and more detailed explanations about this topic. So let's begin. Clauses and sentences in written English. Let's first begin with our few concepts that will give us a clear idea of our subject. What is a clause in written English? A clause is a group of words containing a subject and a verb, a conjugated verb. That is, this verb has to say something about what the subject is or is doing. All right, every sentence in English has at least one clause. And some sentences have two or more clauses. Let's see a few examples of different sentences in English that have a different number of clauses each. Okay, our first example is this sentence here. Scientists are exploring new uses of corn and soybeans. Okay, you can see that this sentence actually has one clause. And you can identify the clause because among this group of words, there is a subject, scientist, about which something is being said. What is being said about scientists? Okay, in this sentence, it is said that scientists are exploring. So are exploring is the conjugated verb, the verb to explore using the present continuous, right? Okay, so we have our subject and our conjugated verb. Of course, together our verb with the rest of the sentence, new uses of corn and soybeans, form what we call our predicate, which is essentially the rest of what is being said about scientists, our subject. So we see that there is one clause, and this clause can stand alone as a complete sentence because it forms a complete thought or idea. Okay? Let's try another sentence example in which we can appreciate two different clauses. Take a look. Before she was 19, Billie Holiday had sung with several bands. Okay, now let's notice the underlined portions first. At the beginning of our sentence, we have the subject she and the conjugated verb was. She was is essentially a clause, and she was 19, of course, is a more complete clause. But take a look that this sentence, in this initial clause, we have a special word before, just prior to our subject she. So we say this whole clause is, our first clause in this sentence is before she was 19, and then the comma ends this first clause. What is the next clause or the second clause in this sentence? Billie Holiday had sung with several bands, and you can appreciate there the subject Billie Holiday and the conjugated verb had sung. So this is our clause number 2. Billie Holiday had sung with several bands. You see, together, these clauses form a sentence. We can understand that the two complement each other, but essentially, the one clause that carries the most important part of the thought is the second one. It could actually stand alone as a complete sentence itself. Billie Holiday had sung with several bands. Yes, we can understand the idea. But before she was 19, it is a clause, but not a complete sentence on its own. You need to put together before she was 19 to the other clause in order to have a complete sentence. Okay, this is very important because this is at the very root of the concept of complex sentence, which we will develop later on. How about another example for a longer sentence with 3 clauses? Yeah, that's interesting. Sentences in written English can be very lengthy. Let's read together. The jaguar has a reputation as a man-eater, but many people tell stories in which a jaguar followed them for hours without attacking. Okay, take a look. This is very, very interesting. We can identify in total 3 different subjects within this sentence, as well as 3 conjugated verbs corresponding to each of the different 3 subjects. So, first we have the jaguar has a reputation as a man-eater. All right, so we call this our clause number 1. Then we have another. It says, many people tell stories in which a jaguar followed them for hours without attacking. Okay, this forms another clause, actually. Okay, and together these 2 clauses, the jaguar has a reputation, etc., and many people tell stories, etc., there are 2 clauses that are connected together to make a sentence. But there's something funny occurring here. Within the second clause, many people tell stories in which a jaguar followed them for hours without attacking. We can see that there is another clause embedded. And you'll see here the subject jaguar and the conjugated verb followed. Okay? All this forms a clause in which a jaguar followed them for hours without attacking. It actually forms another clause. Yeah, but we see that in which a jaguar followed them for hours without attacking cannot stand alone as a complete sentence, right? Yeah. The other 2 might. The jaguar has a reputation as a man-eater could be a complete sentence on its own. Okay, you see that this happens when we have different clauses, right? 2 or more clauses forming sentences. Sometimes within these clauses, there are clauses, or within these sentences, some of the clauses might stand alone as complete sentences themselves, but some other clauses need to be attached or subordinated to other clauses that have a more complete idea. So let's now see another concept, yeah, which we just got an intuition for from the previous examples. There are 2 types of clauses then in written English sentences: independent clauses and subordinate clauses. An independent clause can stand alone as a complete sentence, as we saw in the examples before. But a subordinate clause or dependent clause cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. Yeah, take a look at these 2 examples. If we say some early cultures left no written records for us to discover, and we can identify that this bunch of words form a complete thought or idea. We can identify the conjugated verb and subject. Here we have some early cultures is the subject, and left is the verb, right? And the rest forms a predicate, of course, left no written records for us to discover. But the whole thing is a clause, and at the same time can form a complete sentence. So this is a complete sentence. So independent clauses can form complete sentences on their own. But what about subordinate clauses? If I say, for example, because he wrote bleak plays about human fate. Okay, so we can tell easily why this is a clause. In the first place, we have the subject he and the conjugated verb wrote. He wrote. Yes, this is a clause indeed, this group of words. But there is something here that prevents this clause from being a complete sentence, and that is the sole presence of this word prior to he. The word because, okay, instantly remove because from this clause, and you got he wrote bleak plays about human fate. Yes, that itself could be an independent clause, but notice how placing because before our subject makes that might be independent clause into a subordinate clause. That is, because he wrote bleak plays about human fate cannot be a complete sentence. All right? Why this is not a complete sentence? Why? Okay, you can tell that the word because plays a role, a function in this clause. It calls attention for something else to be said later on, something that may complete, this clause as a whole thought. Because when you listen to the word because, you instantly start thinking about a reason for something. Yeah, because he wrote bleak plays about human fate. Okay, this description that he wrote bleak plays, whoever he might be, means that this is a reason for something else. But what is that something else? Yeah, if we don't see the word because, we don't think about this clause being a reason for something else. But the presence of because help us understand that we need another clause, something else, some more words to complete our thought. So we call this a fragment. It's not a complete sentence, right? It is a fragment. The subordinate clause, because he wrote bleak plays about human fate, we might complete this adding simply another independent clause. Let's see an example. Because he wrote bleak plays, blah, 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 he earned some recognition. Okay, this might be a complete sentence now, because now we are making clear that the first part is a reason for what follows, for this. So this is the reason, this is the consequence. All right, so we have a complete sentence there. Or perhaps instead of this, because he wrote bleak plays, right, about human fate, people thought he was depressive. Okay, that could also be an adequate conclusion that would make some sense with the initial part of the idea. Because he wrote bleak plays, very, very sad stories about human fate. People thought he was depressive. Yeah, so we see there is this subordinate clause becomes complete when you add an independent clause, but on its own, it cannot be a complete sentence, all right? So this is something important to keep in mind. These, as a whole, that group of two clauses, a subordinate clause plus an independent clause, these are indeed complete sentences. So we can understand the idea and the difference between an independent clause and a subordinate clause. An independent clause will become a subordinate clause as soon as we place a special word, such as because or some others, before the subject. Now, let's consider what are the types of sentences in English according to the combination of different independent or dependent clauses. Okay? Based on these ideas, we have the following classification. Now, first, let's go over this definition. What is a sentence then? A sentence is a grammatical unit that expresses a complete thought. A sentence must have at least one independent clause. Yeah, it could be just one independent clause or maybe more independent clauses. But sentences can have three types: simple, compound, or complex. A simple sentence is a sentence that has just one independent clause. A compound sentence has two or more independent clauses joined with a conjunction such as and, but, or so. And a complex sentence has at least one independent clause and one subordinate clause. The subordinate clause begins with a subordinator such as although or before. All right, so now we are seeing the whole picture. There are three types of sentences, and this depends on the kind of clauses that we find in these sentences. Let's see a couple of examples for simple sentences. Take a look at this table. Charles Parsons invented the steam turbine in 1884. So this is very interesting. We can see this is one clause forming a complete sentence because we have our subject, Charles Parsons, invented a conjugated verb, and the rest of words that make for a complete idea. And how about the second one? We see in some forests, the soils are shallow and poor in nutrients. Take a look. We have this fragment here before our subject, the soils, right? The verb is are shallow and poor in nutrients, the complete idea. But we have independent clause here Yeah, the whole thing, the whole group of words is a complete idea and thus a simple sentence. Now let's see examples of a compound sentence. A compound sentence needs two or more independent clauses clearly identified and joined with a special word called a conjunction. For example, take a look here. Erica likes modern art, but she never goes to art museums. Okay, this is interesting because we have here a first clause. Let's underline our first clause. Okay, we have Erica likes modern art. Yes, this is one independent clause. It could stand alone as a complete sentence or a complete idea. Yeah, but here we see this complete idea put together with another complete idea, which is she never goes to art museums. Together, these two clauses, these two independent clauses, form a compound sentence because we have connected them using the word but. Okay, but establishes some kind of contrast here, but at the same time, it also places the two components of this complete thought, the two independent clauses, at the same level of hierarchy, which means none of the two clauses is more important than the other. The two are at the same level of importance within the sentence. It's just a contrast between these two parts of the thought. Let's try another example. The next sentence says, an electric bulb produces light and a radio emits sound energy. All right, take a look. We have one independent clause here. An electric bulb produces light. And the second, a radio emits sound energy. Yeah, we can identify, of course, our subject, electric bulb, produces conjugated verb, right? And here same, a radio, subject, emits, conjugated verb. Yeah, these are two independent clauses and they are being connected by a conjunction, the word and. Yeah, this word actually adds the two parts of the idea together, the two independent clauses, and same as but thus, and places the two components of this idea at a same level of importance. Yeah, none is more important than the other. The two are equally important. That an electric bulb produces light and the fact that a radio emits sound energy. Two parts of a compound sentence. So compound sentences are like this. Okay, you can aggregate two or more independent clauses. Later on, we'll study what are the families of words that can fulfill this role, conjunctions. Here we have just 3 examples, and but, and or so, but there are many, many more. Now, let's try 2 examples for complex sentence. The definition of complex sentence says that you have to spot at least one independent clause and one subordinate clause. So one independent clause alone is not a complex sentence. 2 independent clauses alone are not a complex sentence. There must be at least one subordinate clause. And we've said that subordinate clauses we can identify because they look like clauses, actually they are clauses, but there is this special word, such as before in the first example we saw, that placed just before the subject of the clause makes us realize that this clause cannot stand alone as a complete thought on its own. Let's take a look at the first example. It says, although dogs are primarily carnivores, many will eat fruits and grains. Okay, so let's see what's going on here. We can understand by reading carefully the wording in this sentence that there is a subject here, dogs, and there is a conjugated verb, are. At the same time, it says many, there is a subject here, will eat, the conjugated verb. We have 2 clauses, right? This is one clause, and this is another one. But what's going on? In the initial clause, there is a word although before dogs. And this word, we call it a subordinator, yeah, instantly help us recognize that this is a subordinate clause. If you just say, although dogs are primarily carnivores, although calls for a kind of contrasting idea following what we just said. Although dogs are primarily carnivores, they don't eat as much meat as lions, for example. Or like here, although dogs are primarily carnivores, many will eat fruits and grains. Yeah, some contrast with the clause that follows. This is our independent clause, right? And this is our subordinate clause. Putting them together, the first attached to the second in meaning, we have a complex sentence. A very basic complex sentence, by the way. Let's try the last example. It says the electric trolley had dominated city streets before buses took over. So we can spot our first clause, the electric trolley had dominated, is a subject and conjugated verb. And then we have another clause, before buses took over, buses subject to cover verb. Before is this subordinator placed before buses indicates that this clause cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. Yeah, if you just said out of the blue, before buses to cover, anyone listening to you would say, okay, so what? Yeah, before this, what happened? Yes, you need something else to complete the idea. And here is, we can say, before buses took over, the electric trolley had dominated city streets. Yeah, we can exchange the order of the two clauses. The completeness of this thought will not change. We will have a complete thought all the same. Okay, so we're seeing a few examples of sentence types. Let's now talk about the different types of subordinate clauses that may exist in written English. We've said that a subordinate clause has a subject and a verb, but does not express a complete idea, right? They are fragments, they are incomplete sentences, so to speak, right? Examples, when you say, because it's hollow, okay, you're giving a reason for something else, right? So we could complete this idea only if we add another clause. Let's, for example, suggest here, right? Because it is hollow, a balloon can float. Yeah, for example, right? Imagine that I complete here, because it is hollow, a balloon can float. Perhaps. What about the second? If two lines in the same plane are parallel, okay, again, we have a clause. Two lines are parallel. Two lines are subject and verb. But our if before the subject makes clear that what we just said is a condition for something else or a reason for something else to happen. It is not a complete sentence on its own if two lines in the same plane are parallel, but if we add some independent clause, such as they will never cross. How about this? If two lines in the same plane are parallel, they will never cross. Yeah, this is true about parallel lines, right? Lines that never cross, always at the same distance from one another. Let's try a third example of a subordinate clause. That a boat displaces water. Okay, a boat is a subject, displaces is a conjugated verb, but this is not a complete thought because it has that before. And that, as a relative pronoun, might imply that this is what someone is saying. For example, Mario says that a boat displaces water, for example, right? And then I have a complete sentence. And then that a boat displaces water would be attached to the whole clause. Mario says that a boat displaces water, and this that a boat displaces water would be working as the direct object of the verb says. Mario says something. What does Mario say? That a boat displaces water. Yeah, we have a complete sentence there. So very interesting how subordinate clauses can blend in with dependent clauses in order to make complete sentences. We have a fourth example, unless it stops raining. Okay, again, similar to what if does in the second example, unless implies this is a negative condition for something else to happen. Unless it stops raining, so what? I don't understand what you're trying to say. Yeah, this is not a complete sentence. But if I add, for example, unless it stops raining, we can't go out for a picnic. Similar to say, if it doesn't stop raining, we cannot go out for a picnic. Yes, and that would be a complete idea or thought and a complete sentence, right? So we see how subordinate clauses, very interesting, because if you, in each of these examples, remove the first word, remove the subordinator, I'm encircling them, each of them with a red circle. these words, because, if, that, unless, these words can be removed. If I remove them, then what is left in each case is an independent clause. It is hollow. Two lines in the same plane are parallel. A boat displaces water. It stops raining. Yeah, they sound like complete ideas on its own. Of course, provided that we have some appropriate context where we can express these ideas or sentences or clauses, right? Yeah, but once we place because, if, that, and unless before them, it makes very difficult to predict what might come next, what might be said or be heard later on. We've just provided a few examples of how these sentences could end, right? If these were subordinate clauses, we could add some independent clauses in order to complete the ideas. Okay, so it's very important then, in order to fully be able to recognize a complete sentence and the kind of sentence where subordinate clauses appear, as you can see, is the complex sentence. This is our most important type of sentence in written English, right? So complex sentence is what we want to study in depth, because complex sentences are at the core of written discourse. When you want to read an academic text or serious texts in English dealing with serious issues, you will see plenty of complex sentences. So you need to be able to identify the structure of these sentences in order to fully catch meaning. Okay, so let's study a little more about subordinate clauses then. We have here a very, very succinct list of the most common subordinators in English. Okay, we call subordinators these words such as before, although, right? If, we've seen them just a moment ago, that, because, etc. Because these words placed before an independent clause make it a subordinate clause, and thus instantly when you see this word together with everything that follows, until a comma, for example, will be a subordinate clause. Okay? You see, for example, after placed before a subject indicates that you are giving some time frame or condition for something else to be said, right? For example, after I did my homework, comma, I went to bed. You can understand this as, okay, as if, even if, just as, will study in future lessons. But since the common meaning of these words is very, very well known in English, we'll now see how these clauses can be used and applied in different complex sentences. Subordinate clauses, for example, the clauses in the previous table can be classified according to the role. Let's see these three roles: the function as an adverb, as an adjective, and a noun. When you have a subordinate clause working as an adverb within a sentence, it might modify or tell you some attribute, some characteristic of the conjugated verb. For example, our minds remain active while we are sleeping. Yeah, you can see that this is the subordinate clause, right? While we are sleeping, the subordinate clause. Here is our subordinator, while, the subject, and the conjugated verb. So, what is this subordinate clause doing for the whole sentence? It actually tells you when the action verb occurs. Because in the main clause, our minds remain active. What is going on? Take a look. Our minds is the subject. What they say in this sentence about our minds is that they remain active. So we can instantly formulate the question: when do our minds remain active? When? Can we answer to that? Yes, while we're sleeping, our minds remain active. So this structure here is working as an adverb of time. It is not an adverb because it is a lot of words. It's a clause. But the function of this group of words, of this subordinate clause, is like an adverb of time for the verb remain. It's modifying the word remain, so it's working like an adverb. So let's see another example here. As the Yellowstone River moves eastward, it picks up the waters of three other rivers. Okay, the Yellowstone River is the subject in this subordinate clause, moves, conjugated verb, We have our subordinator, us, which in this context pretty much means the same as while, right? While the Yellowstone River moves eastward, it picks up the waters of 3 other rivers. Yeah, while or as, and the conjugated verb and the subject in the main clause, you can see it picks up. So it, of course, refers to the Yellowstone River. So it says that the Yellowstone River picks up the waters of 3 other rivers. When does that happen? When does the river, the Yellowstone River, picks up the waters of other rivers? And the answer is, again, when the Yellowstone River moves eastward, or as, or while the Yellowstone River moves eastward. That is when it picks up the waters of 3 other rivers. So we can see that this whole adverb clause or subordinate clause is working as an adverb of time, because it tells you when is the action of picking up occurring. This is an adverb of time for this verb in the main clause. Okay, so now you can see that subordinate clauses can act as adverbs in a complex sentence. What about adjective clauses? Take a look at the next example. A zoologist is a scientist who studies animals. We have a main clause. Here is zoologist is a scientist. Okay, but it says a scientist who studies animals. So now we are saying something about this scientist. The words who studies animals somehow tell you what kind of scientist is a zoologist. In order to answer this question, what kind of scientist is a zoologist? Well, you could say, oh, it's a very clever scientist, it's a humanitarian scientist, is a very active scientist, is a good scientist, or is a scientist that believes in God, or is a scientist who studies animals. We are using the whole clause who studies animals as an adjective for scientists. So we say it's an adjective modifier for scientists. This whole thing here is working as an adjective for scientists, in the same way as good or clever could do. A zoologist is a scientist, is a clever scientist, is a scientist who studies animals. We see that this subordinate clause actually modifies a noun within the main clause or independent clause. Another example, the discovery of fire, says next, which happened about 1 million years ago, provided humans with heat for cooking and warmth. We have a very long sentence, a very long independent clause, which essentially is the discovery of fire provided blah, blah, blah. Yeah, this is our subject. This is our conjugated verb in the main clause or independent clause. But what about this subordinate clause embedded within our independent clause? This which happened about 1 million years ago. We know it is a clause because it has a subject, which, and a conjugated verb, happened, which happened. But the thing is, what is this saying within our sentence? It is saying some attribute, some characteristic of the subject of the sentence, the subject of the main or independent clause, the discovery of fire. It is actually describing the discovery of fire. So what was the discovery of fire like? Okay, it happened about 1 million years ago. It is something that we can describe with this word. The discovery of fire, something, an event that happened about 1 million years ago, that event provided humans with. Okay, so this is very interesting how adjective clauses work in a sentence. Normally, adjective clauses will be attached, following immediately the noun that they modify. For example, in the first sentence, a zoologist is blah, 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 who studies animals, is attached to scientist. It modifies scientist. What is scientist in that sentence? It's actually a subject complement, right? But in the second example, which happened about 1 million years ago, is attached to the discovery of fire. And what is the discovery of fire? Is the subject of our sentence. Because an adjective modifies a noun or a noun clause, we can see how these subordinate clauses in these two last examples actually fit the function of an adjective. But subordinate clauses in English can also play another role, which is very amazing. Let's take a look at this example now. Scholars have long debated how the universe began. We can identify instantly how the underlying clause is a subordinate clause. Take a look. Here's the subject. Here is the conjugated verb. Okay, a subordinator, how. And what is the independent clause? Scholars have long debated how the universe began. The whole thing is the independent clause. If I ask you this question, what have scholars long debated? What is the subject of their debate? You would say, oh, how the universe began. That is what they debate. Yes, we could actually replace this whole clause here, how the universe began, with, for example, it or something, right? Scholars have long debated it, have long debated something. Yes, what is the role of this fragment then? How the universe began is the direct object of the verb debated or have debated. This is a noun clause being the direct object of the verb have debated. What have they debated? How the universe began. That is the subject. And so we see how a subordinate clause in a complex sentence can perform the role of a direct object, which is supposed to be a noun, but it could also perform the role of a subject of the sentence. Take a look at this next amazing sentence. What predicts life satisfaction in middle adulthood has been the subject of much research on young adults. So it's very interesting. In this sentence, it is said that something has been the subject of much research on young adults. What is that something that has been the subject? The something that has been the subject, and thus, therefore, the subject of our sentence, of our independent clause, is this whole subordinate clause. What predicts life satisfaction, right? Here we can see what works as a subject of the clause, predicts works as a conjugated verb, and we have the whole thing being the subject of the independent clause, blah, 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 has been the subject of much research on young adults. So we see subordinate noun clauses work as nouns. It could be direct objects, it could be subjects within an independent clause. And because of that, they are embedded in the independent clauses. So now we're seeing the examples of the functions of these subordinate clauses. What is next? Okay, there are some special clauses and embedded clauses that we need to be aware of. For example, there are some sentences that start with the word there as a false subject. And in these sentences, the verb is usually a form of be, right? Let's see a couple of examples. There is a thick wall of cellulose surrounding every plant cell. Okay, think about it. Is there really the subject? No. When you say there, this is no subject, although it is followed by the conjugated verb. The true subject is what follows is, because here is, the verb to be, is being used as a synonym to exist, right? A thick wall of cellulose surrounding every plant cell exists. We could say that, right? All of this, a thick wall surrounding every plant cell exists. So this would be the true subject of our sentence, right? Is the conjugated verb, but there is a false subject. Another example, in Canada, there are two official languages, English and French. Okay, take a look. If you say this, there are two official languages, English and French, there is no the subject, but two official languages, English and French, is the true subject of the sentence. We could say, two official languages, English and French, exist in Canada. So, this is truly the subject of the sentence. And it's possible that a clause can contain another clause. Here we can see, in a dry steam reservoir, the steam is piped to where it can spin turbines that generate electricity. Take a look. The main clause is actually the whole sentence. The steam is piped to where it can spin turbines that generate electricity. But we can see that there are several subordinate clauses at different levels of embedding. First, we can say that the steam is piped to something, and that something is where it can spin turbines that generate electricity. Yes, so this is working as like an indirect object or an object of a preposition for the verb is piped. And then within this one, we can see that where it can spin turbines that generate electricity is an adjective clause that is modifying turbines because it tells you what kind of turbines they are. Okay, it can spin turbines that generate electricity. So this is an adjective clause. This adjective clause is modifying turbines, and at the same time, turbines is part of where it can spin turbines, which is another subordinate clause, right? And this subordinate clause is a noun clause. And the whole thing, right? This noun clause works as an indirect object for the verb piped. And what is the main clause, the subject and the conjugated verb in the main clause? This is steam and is piped to. This is the subject and the verb of the independent clause or main clause. So you see how clauses can be embedded in a complex sentence. The level of embedding can be actually quite deep. All right, this is the end of our first session for clauses and sentences. There is a number of practice questions that we'll deal with in a following session where you see how to put to the test the concepts of clauses and sentences, the types of clauses, independent clauses, subordinate clauses, and the types of sentences, which is simple sentences, compound sentences, and complex sentences. We'll be seeing this exercise in another session very soon. Thank you very much.